Hello, one and all. It's time for a one-off podcast with your conventional hosts of the past. Back for another one. I'm Taylor the Toaster. I'm here with Nick Weston and Toon Ganondorf, getting the gang back together to talk about a one-off topic. We want to call this one kind of remembering the reboot, as it were, because, well, let's just say when we were going over all the topics like the top 100 most iconic robots in Robot Wars, we were always quite careful to avoid recency bias, and that was because the reboot was quite fresh in our minds and new. But now we're in the year 2022, and the Robot Wars reboot, unfortunately for our ages and egos, it's quite old itself now. So we wanted to take a historic look back with the three of us and kind of see what's changed since then, what we could do better, and just reflect on what it once was. So I'll hand over to the rest of the gang, and we'll get started.
Hello, everybody. I suppose we'll do our belated check-in and say hello so that the audience knows it is, in fact, us. Nick?
Yeah, I'm here too.
Very good. Like Toast said, we do want to just do a bit of a reflection on the reboot, because the three of us, I think in particular, sort of only really became friends through the reboot. We've all worked on the Robot Wars Wiki throughout time, but never with a huge overlap. And so that's where I sort of want to start with, is step one is, where were you when the Robot Wars reboot was announced? Because for those who don't really know the ins and outs of the Robot Wars Wiki and the contributors, I was one of the very, very first. So my prime was like 2009 through to about 2011. Whereas Nick and Toast were contributors sort of more recently than that. And I had gone on to do other things because I was fairly busy. And then when the reboot was announced, I had just started my very first job out of university, and my brother was the one who mentioned it to me, of all people. And he said, "Did you know that they're doing another Robot Wars?" And initially I was like, "Oh, I don't care." But then, of course, drifted back, looked at who was coming back, and that whole excitement came up. And that's I initially actually got to messaging Toast and was talking about it, because Toast was running the wiki at that point. And we were talking about a few bits and pieces, and the whole novelty of interacting this time with Roboteers as the show happened, which is a topic we'll come back to in a second. So that's where I was. I got brought back into Robot Wars, and I went from about 0 to 100 on my passion for the show. And yeah, that's me. Nick, what about you?
Yeah, I think...
Nick, you sound so different. Toast, how about you?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, fair. I guess that makes sense, because if Toon Ganondorf was the 0 to 100, then at the time I was probably the 100 to 100.
500,
Yeah, I think you can kind of place all three of our wiki presences in a timeline. You know, Toon Ganondorf started it off and then disappeared. Nick was a more recent addition. Like, he'd come along before the reboot. He just happened to be, I'll let him explain it for himself, but was just getting back into it at the time through coincidence. Whereas I was the one that had taken the wiki over in maybe 2012 kind of time to just keep it alive in the depths of when the show was most dead. And the reboot happening is not something I expected at all, because, you know, you would think if you were even slightly involved, you'd probably kind of get the idea that it was going to happen. Roboteers had been told. They were clearly doing a fairly good job of keeping the secret. But I had absolutely no idea, and I'm sure the same goes for many of the people listening to this. But I was still very much in a Robot Wars phase, almost manufacturing one for myself, just because I hadn't full committed into other interests that I'd dive into. Or basically I was in first year of university at this point, and instead of having a social life, going out drinking, I was just living with an ex-girlfriend of the time and making her watch Robot Wars with me. I think you can tell why that one's not going on anymore, but bless her. She did create a fun story for me, in that she actually found out about the reboot before I did. I was just kind of out shopping, walking around the game shops and getting some food in, and I was just offline. I didn't even have mobile data on my phone at this point because I was a poor student, basically. She just kind of rang me and said, "Isaac, you need to come home now." And I thought, what?
The pipes burst.
For that kind of urgency, I feel like there's only one thing this could possibly be, but surely not, right? And I just had this silent headspace for 10 minutes. I walked in the shop, I came back, I just thought, what could possibly warrant this kind of reaction? I'm trying to quell the idea that it could be Robot Wars, because surely there's no way,
Only you could think, oh, you need to come home right now, and you think, oh, it must be Robot Wars being rebooted.
Yeah, right? 10 years later, but it's like, what could possibly, like, not wait? And that was, unfortunately, I don't know what kind of story that tells, probably nothing good. But it allowed me to finally get the cogs whirring. And indeed, I was right. It was kind of a BBC News article was just revealed before my eyes, and I just thought, oh my God, there's no way. I've got work to do. Bloody hell, I'm running the wiki in the peak times. What's going to happen? But yeah, I'm almost kind of having my Toon Ganondorf moment now of cooling down on the Robot Wars and moving on from my peak phase. But I went at the point of the reboot. Oh my word, we went from bad to worse.
Wouldn't change it for the world, though. Come on,
no,
it was great.
Yeah, the site needed me.
Yes, needed you and another one of you, to be honest.
True. King of Bots Wiki.
Oh, we're not going there.
That is definitely the peak of Robot Wars passion, is the fact that Toast and I said, yeah, we can run a King of Bots Wiki. We don't speak Chinese, but I'm sure we can put something together.
Specifically, you said
Yes.
we could run a King of Bots Wiki, and I didn't say no sternly enough before it got made. I'm like, oh well, here we go.
Jesus wept.
Did you just say Jesus wept?
So what's your story then?
I did, yes.
All right, Nick, what's your story?
Right, we'll just keep up the trend, shall we? I didn't find out myself about the show coming back. My sister did,
I
because
knew
of
you'd
course
say
she did.
that.
Couldn't be me. Yeah, couldn't be me. Just came home one day, and she didn't plan this dramatic announcement of, you've got to be home right now. No, I opened the door, she comes up to me, just nonchalantly says, oh, Nick, Robot Wars is back. And then trotted upstairs. And I was like, what? And then I opened my phone, loaded up the BBC, thought, yeah, that's quite cool. Let's go on the wiki. And then, yeah, live.
What does it say about our investigative journalism that none of the
one
three
of
of
the
us
three.
found out about it on our own?
Well, that was all part of the surprise, wasn't it? If we found out naturally ourselves, then maybe we wouldn't have been as excited. That initial burst of adrenaline created the King of Bots wiki and all of this other wonderful stuff. Like, you never know, you might have not been as excited if you just found out yourselves.
Well, definitely. I'm certainly glad that I got to have a story out of it and be told. Otherwise, this podcast would be pretty flat if I just said, oh, I went on Twitter and there it was.
Well, yeah, I mean, in your case, it was like a mixture of this could be a life-changing event, or it could be a life-changing event that's also Robot Wars. So I guess there was more.
Yeah. All I knew
Stakes there
was
for
that
you.
it was something positive. It wasn't exactly getting dragged back to me flat because my granddad's in hospital or something. It was like...
Well, maybe
Come
he was
home for
excited about
something
Robot
good.
Wars as
Or
well.
something-
Maybe
something
that's why
like-
he's in hospital.
Toast, you need to come home. Someone set Pastor on fire.
Fucking hell.
There's no greater significance to that sentence, I'm sure.
Yeah, that is the worst part of the reboot. Forget like the King of Bots wiki and stuff. That is the peak / the worst part. At the same
So
time.
just because
Reboot's Bastigate.
I deplore in jokes, for those who know, when the three of us caught up, I went to England for a holiday and caught up with these two. We recorded the Firestorm podcast among other activities, and I said let's cook dinner, and somehow Toast managed to put a standard packet of spaghetti into a saucepan, and not only managed to char it to the bottom, he actually managed to set it on fire, which I didn't even know was possible. So yeah, got back home, and it was like, you know, a flaming brand, like flame at the end of a piece of wood, but the piece of wood is pasta. So
it was the Inferno insurrection in real life.
It
for us,
exactly was.
I think it's
Yeah.
so
And
funny.
I think it's reasonable to say that you know, as a 20-something-year-old teenager, I basically, well, that doesn't make sense. A young teenager stroke 20-something, I basically substituted life lessons on, you know, how to cook, how to be social for I've just started uni and Robot Wars has come back, let's carry on being a child for the next 3 years.
Well,
Substituted all life
I mean,
skills
to be
for
fair,
robots.
at least you didn't like cook a weapon motor or something. It could have gone even worse knowing you were Robot Wars at the time. So I'll give you a little bit of a leeway there.
Essence a la Scar, get a bit of that 2000.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And now we cut to 2022, and Toast is somehow allowed to work with live machinery and robots when he literally couldn't even boil pasta without burning the bottom of it, which I believe is an old saying.
It's just the reflecting on the Robot Wars reboot or reflecting on my life.
Yes. So anyway, so let's.
As I'd like to think I've come a long way.
I'd like to think so too.
You have.
All
We're
right,
proud.
so let's cut to some topics of conversation. What do you guys think led to the Robot Wars reboot happening? Well, obviously we don't know for sure, but obviously Toast, I'll get you to give a little bit of backstory with the whole the production company and the guys who were involved with that, and maybe some transition from live scene. But in addition to that, what do you think made BBC take the chance on it?
These days we have a bit of a clearer picture of how it came to be than we did at the time. We've had a lot of insight in podcasts from the likes of, well, Robo Challenge, the guys who built the house robots and served as semi-producers, helping to pick the competitors and do the tech checks and all of that stuff while it was going on. You know, if you're not familiar with Robo Challenge, from the Robot Wars side, then anyone who's seen the season of BattleBots that they were on with Quantum or King of Bots with Spectre, you know, we've had our chances to get to know Robo Challenge as competitors these days, but they are a business. That's why they were tasked to make the house robots, and their story is that basically the BBC roped them in to work on some kind of miscellaneous semi-educational tech program, which was at the time more going to be a drones thing from the sounds of it. The funny thing is there was actually a CBBC show called Airmageddon that appeared kind of not long after the Robot Wars reboot or around the same time. So I think it's kind of clear to see the BBC ended up splitting their ideas and going down the middle. But Robo Challenge, they basically take credit for the fact that, you know, BBC wanted to make a tech show and they brought these guys on board with it. And they just kind of came forward and said, well, why not Robot Wars? Because, indeed, why not Robot Wars? Who wants a drone show when you can have this
With an
thing that was
established
a big
fan base.
craze in the 2000s on your own channel, and enough time has passed to make it worth bringing back. So I think it does say a lot that it was never on the BBC's minds in the first place to bring Robot Wars back, and they had to be kind of pushed into it. It'd be good to know more of the BBC's point of view on it, because obviously we've only heard the Robo Challenge side. But yeah, basically they needed to fit that educational bill, and somehow we were able to wiggle it into being Robot Wars.
Which I think is pretty amazing, all things considered. I wonder whether the overtly disproportionately passionate fan base of Robot Wars versus the Robot Wars Wiki had anything to do with it. Part of me thinks that it does, because, you know, we've seen a few times now, like, some fairly well-known Twitter personalities who've discovered the Robot Wars Wiki and just like laughed about how incredibly in-depth it is. And, you know, people can laugh, but I'm still very proud of it. And yeah, part of me wonders whether someone would have said, well, look, if this is what the fans have done with a relatively, yes, it had its merchandise and it was popular, but like to this extent, where you've got bloody Brimher has got an article on the wiki, for example, then part of me thinks that might have had some sway in influencing the BBC and their decision.
It's certainly a bit of evidence out there to show the fan, maybe the more 80-20 in the marketing terms. We were definitely the 20, but I think it's quite clear to see from other sites how much the wiki can actually have an impact. We know. I was just reading through some King of Bots official articles one day, digging through it with my housemate Adam from Team Immersion, and he found an old article about a King of Bots article that had been released only to the Chinese audience, and we didn't realise, even though we'd written the King of Bots wiki in English, this entirely separate Chinese business had actually started pulling images and even some like battle results from our own site, and we got to see how we'd affected the growth of that show while it was happening. Certainly from a Robot Wars point of view, it's never been mentioned. I think the closest we got is there's a couple of things in the Haynes manual that Robo Challenge wrote that have clearly at least borrowed a bit from the wiki, like the results section that had Anvil of all things in it. You'd never catch the BBC commenting on it, but I think it's true that Robot Wars had always just attracted passionate fans in general, and we were just kind of one facet of what could come of that. At the end of the day, just as it works for the passionate teenage fans, it's also got a massive potential with kids, and lost in the Reboot's attempt to capture a new audience. Clearly it, in a lot of cases, wasn't going for the same audience that it originally was. But yeah, I mean, what do you think, Nick? Is there any more we can kind of think on the...
Well, I mean, my initial thought process of when this idea was proposed was that, yeah, it probably would have just been something completely opportunistic that happened and it all fell together. And that kind of sounds like what it was, and it doesn't surprise me. I know they'd been pushing for it at a couple of other stations and other channels here and there over the years, and a lot of people were going to knock it back and did knock it back. And yeah, as you said, there was a gap that appeared at the time that they needed to fill up. They managed to convince them to take it, and I think that was all that it was, and we just kind of got lucky that it eventually got pushed through, because we could have still been waiting until now otherwise. But the time gap from when it was first cancelled and the moment being right, coming together, I think that was it. I'd like to believe that the passionate fans had a massive say in it, but I don't know. The first thing that someone would probably say when they're trying to get an old show back on air is like, oh, it has such a passionate fan base, it will get such support. And I think that would just be like a buzzword or a buzz phrase that anybody would use to try and convince somebody to take a chance on it again. So I think in this case, it's just one of those things that it is what it is, and it came together.
That's right. And I think with Robot Wars, it's also worth remembering there was a bit of a benchmark that if this proposal was brought up even a year or two earlier, it wouldn't have existed. Namely, the Robot Wars reboot happened in 2016, and the comeback of the BattleBots reboot was in 2015. So one whole season of a modern-day robot combat show existed at the time of at least the Robot Wars reboot being proposed. And in a sense, it's kind of hard to know if that impacted the decision at all, because when you're approaching it, you kind of want to think, okay, is this American equivalent a success? But there was only one season, and it was on a major network like ABC, and ultimately after that second season, it did get cancelled. So as it turned out, for that channel, it probably didn't do very well. Nowadays, it's doing fantastically for a more niche channel like Discovery Channel. But I have to wonder if the presumed success of BattleBots in 2015 was enough evidence to say that Robot Wars was worth a go, or if it genuinely just would have happened anyway, and the stars just kind of aligned when they wanted that drones show or whatever, and Robot Wars was the next best thing.
That's a good point. All right, well, in the interest of time, I think we'll keep moving along, which is to now discuss Series 8. Now, we're all familiar with the format of those, if watching and listening to this channel know the format of Series 8. So let's just cut straight to it and go, what were your thoughts on Series 8's format when you first came across it? Obviously, the caveat to that is that we all wanted more episodes and more robots, but for the first one, we were all thought, oh, look, this will do. Like, a couple of episodes, let it grow, and then see what it becomes. So, Nick, we'll go to you first. What did you think of the format? Any thoughts you want to raise on how it was formatted and what was involved?
Yeah, well, obviously nowadays the round robin system is kind of looked back on for all of its flaws, but I can't lie and say that at the time that I was thinking, oh yeah, this is going to be terrible, because at the time it sounded quite exciting and people assumed that there'd be more reliable robots, there'd be better robots, you'd get more fights, it would be a more fast-flowing show in general with less dead air time and less filler. So I completely saw the logic in what they were going for, and the fact that they wanted to experiment with that was probably the right move, even though it wasn't perfect. I also think it was much better to go with that and then work from there and see what you could change to make it better, rather than going safe and going with like a classic series, just straight one-on-one knockout in round 2 and then a heat final type thing. I don't think that would have been appealing enough. So for what they went for at the time, yeah, I completely understand the logic behind it.
Well, it's a very good point, because what people don't remember is that even at like Series 5, when you had 4 round 1s, that was a maximum of 7 fights, whereas this we had a guaranteed 9 fights. Yeah. But as you say, we all look back on it and we think, well, I would have rather less fights, but better ones. Toast, what do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because not only was I really excited for this format, that's nowadays looked back on not so positively, I think that even after Series 8 had finished, I still thought of it as a success. It's only really Series 9 that started to lower the effect of it, with a lot of dud fights in the late stages. At least two of the 5 heats had a dropout in it by the end. But for Series 8, if the main problems with the round robin is dud fights and robots dropping out in the middle of the second round, certainly dud fights were there, but they weren't necessarily the fault of the round robin yet, because there weren't quite as many spinners to pummel things into the dust and make them unusable for the rest of the heat. And the only dropout ended up being Chompalot, which honestly helped the narrative of that episode. It got Pulsar back in and made a real story of events. I was really excited for the round robin format, because it was basically a case of episodes used to be 40 minutes, including ads on Channel 5, or they just filled a 40-minute time slot on the BBC. Now they're an hour, and we're simply using that extra time to get more fights. And we come from the Wiki, where we're used to putting robots in like fantasy tournaments and basing them off of one fight 17 years later. So the idea of having some guaranteed extra fights out of a robot sounded fantastic to us. You win one fight and you're guaranteed 4. It was still ultimately a shame that in all of these series with 40 robots, 20 of them will fall in the first round and you won't see them again. That's why in the end, when we get to Series 10, we feel that the format they settled on in the end was a greater success. But I think it is only in Series 9 where the cracks in the armour actually started to slip through. And if you ask me, Series 8, format-wise, was great, and I wouldn't change it. If we had the power of hindsight, I think Series 9 would have benefited from a different format. But, if you put me in the producer's shoes after Series 8, if you ask me, did the round robin format go well? I'd say yes, and I would probably run it again.
I agree with you because I'm just looking at them again now. And obviously, we all had the huge disappointment of episode 1 where Terahertz's axe wasn't working, and episode 2 where we would just constantly have all of Mr. Speed Square's unreliability and Foxic's presence. And then you had episode 3 where you've got King Buxton, who, bless his heart, is by far the weakest one there, and there's really not much tension in fights like that. But episode 4 and 5, and I would also argue 1, are examples of where the round robin format was at its best. Where Apollo, yes, it does lose to Eruption, but it wins the other 2, which is what it needs to get through. Whereas Eruption, yes, it beats the champion, but it can't come up clutch against Storm 2 or PP3D. That's where the round robin format worked, because just because you can beat the best, if you can't beat the second and the third best, then you're not going to make it. And that's what I really liked about it. And I think that what we can all take away from it is that the round robin format worked really well, except for spinners. And that's when Series 9, which was a lot more spinner heavy, you see, episode 1 where you've got Aftershock and Sabretooth, and episode 2 where you've got PP3D, and episode 3 you've got Concussion and Mr. Speed Squared, episode 4 you've got Pulsar, Supernova and Ironside, and then episode 5 you've got Carbide. So every single one of season 9's episodes had at least one, maybe 2 heavy spinners that were capable of absolutely wrecking competitors and therefore detracting from the show. Whereas I would argue season 8 really only had episode 5, where it was Ironside and Pulsar again going up against Chompalot and Gabriel and Beast. So yeah, I think in hindsight I definitely agree with you. Round Robin was great for Series 8, but they should have taken it for Series 9.
Yeah, it's an objective fact that the likes of Mr. Speed Squared, Foxic, even King B, and maybe Nuts not doing well in their repeated round robin battles did kind of drag down those episodes in Series 8 specifically. But if you want to change the format to cut down on the dud robots arguably wasting time in the earlier heats of Series 8, then that does mean it comes at a cost of some really good second round fights in the likes of Heat 4 and 5. And at the end of the day, it's just bad luck that some less successful robots happened to get through to that stage. It wasn't really the format's fault, more just the fault of the draw for cutting out on Supernova in a round 1 draw. Or who else in Series 8 did we lose far too early? Razor is obviously a huge example of that.
Tough as Nails is a huge one that we lost.
They never could have known that Orte was going to die so easily. Like, if you just spread the draw a little bit more and maybe sacrifice a couple of robots like Foxic and King B from the second round, then you can make it so every heat has a really good round robin draw in Series 8, and it could have been overall a big success. It
almost would have been better. Could they have done a way where, and this might have been overcomplicating the format, but where you have sort of like Series 10, where you have who wins, so 2 of them go through, and then the third place goes into the losers melee, and the 4th one gets eliminated. Because if you think about it that way, you lose arguably Killy Cranky, the General, or Bonk, depending on who got immobilized first. You lose Chimera, you lose Disconstructor, you lose Orte, and you lose Overdoser. But they're the ones that you should lose. But then you keep Tough as Nails, and you keep I don't want to say Draven, but you keep Razor. You keep Thermidor too. The ones who you want to keep for a second fight, because like you said, it's so hard to do a fantasy tournament for Orte because none of us know anything about it because it moved in one fight and we never got to see it again. So that is where you wonder about it. And then in Series 9, what would you have done differently for Series 9 with the exact same lineup? Would you have done a Series 5 format where you do 4 one-on-ones, or would you do some other sort of, or would you do like a series, some other format perhaps, or a Series 7 format where you don't do the round robin at all and you just do a straight Behemoth fights PP3D, Eruption fights Cherub, and then Behemoth fights Eruption in the Heat final, for example. What would you do, Nick?
I think Series 9 was always going to be flawed in that department, no matter the format. There were too many explosive, powerful spinners that would have created random dud fights, and the round robin wasn't good for it. But at the same time, if we only had like one fight in round 2, then a random dud fight would have been even more notable and hard to take if it was just leading to a random good machine, especially just leaving like that.
I suppose you're right there in that it also, how do you fill an episode if you're going to cut from 9 fights down to
well,
2,
exactly.
3, 4,
the fights
5,
were so short.
then that's a lot of filler.
The fights were short in Series 9 as well.
And Angela Scanlon, bless her heart, she can do anything as far as I'm concerned, but even that much filler might be beyond her.
Yeah.
But yeah, Series 9, to have a specific format, I really don't know what they could have done. I probably would have just stuck with the round robin, because even though it was a disaster in places, you had to fill the time up. So
Exactly. I think if I was in the same position, then that's ultimately the decision I would have arrived at, because yes, we complain about Series 9 now for how the second round really dragged things out and had a lot of duds and a lot of dropouts, but there would have been even worse complaints, I think, if they made the decision in advance to say, look, it's not going to work for this one, we'll just go down to single elimination, we're losing fights, we're gaining filler, and we never would have been able to prove that the failures of the round robin system would have happened. And even then,
well, yeah, that's the thing. If it failed so bad having just a standard elimination in Series 9, then you'd go back to the round robin in Series 10 and never end up with the most desired formula in the end anyway. So
exactly. And out of the 5 episodes of Series 9, they all kind of failed in different ways. The main problem for Heat 1 was losing Rapid after Aftershock beat it, and then Jellyfish was forced to take its place, whereas if it was single elimination, then we wouldn't have had to see Rapid in a bad light for that. You've got Heat 3 and 4, where the spinners were just kind of overpowering the competition and the rest of them weren't up to scratch. Series 5 Heat 5 was just too much of a 2-horse race, with Carbide and Apollo being uncontested by everything else. But you still have Heat 2, where I guess the objective flaw is people disagreeing with Cherub winning all the time, but I don't think there was really any particularly bad fights in that heat. It still shows that if the field was balanced enough, the format still worked on occasion, and I think Series 8 went well enough to justify giving it another go for Series 9. Obviously, power of hindsight, they added a lot more spinners and it was going to create these issues. But I think the main thing that also made Series 9 sting a little bit more was the increase of unknowns that we lost in round 1 and didn't get another fight out of. Because if you look at Series 8, there's still robots that we lost in the first round that we would have preferred not to. Like Supernova would have been a great presence in the second round, but at least for Series 9 they came back. Razor getting more fights in Series 8 again would have helped, but it was maybe a singular exception to be that bad. Pulsar could have been a dramatic loss, but it did get through in the end.
Yeah, like we knew Razor and Tough as Nails and Thermidor too, so losing them in first round sucked, but we got to see them. Whereas, is what you're saying, like there were robots we lost in the first round of Series 9 that we never got to see how good they were?
Exactly right. How do you judge Killy? How do you judge Cranky? We can't, because it got one opportunity and it blew it. It could have been quite good, but we'll never know. Tauron 1, even more so. That seems on the surface like a solid robot, but it had one singular proving ground and couldn't do it. Push to Exit was a mystery in our minds for the whole year. Mega Mouse we knew was at least a fairly good robot, but it happened to draw Carbide, and so that was it. We're not going to see it again unless someone later in the heat were to drop out. And there's still plenty that we could have coped with seeing only once, like Chimera and Expulsion and, sad as it is, Crustacean. But so many robots exited Series 9 as just as much of an unknown quantity as when they came in. And again, you have half the field exiting immediately and half of them being dragged through a process where they simply weren't fit enough to complete 4 fights. That's why it ended up as quite a conclusive failure in the end. I don't think I would have changed the format of Series 9 before it took place. It's only with the power of hindsight where, some kind of double elimination format to get everyone a second fight and not give them unnecessary third and fourths would have been better in the end. But I don't think... I think it would have been brave to make that decision.
Let's talk about double eliminations as our immediate transition to Series 10, where we lost 10 competitors, but I don't think there would be anybody here who would disagree that the format was better in Series 10. Obviously, if you doubled the number of... you had 10 episodes, that'd be even better. But I think that we all agree that having 2 fights per robot, take a robot like Apocalypse... I'm thrilled that we got 2 Apocalypse fights, because that was one of the unknowns, and in Series 9 it would have probably got smacked by, Concussion or Supernova or Carbide, and we would never have seen it and would never have known it was any good. And yes, it lost its 2 fights, but at least we saw its axe working, and it fought 3 very, very different robots in Apollo, the Swarm, and Sabretooth. And that was fun. So, thoughts on the Series 10 format?
Yeah, you could even take another example with someone who just, in the end, did quite poorly. Push to Exit went from an 0-1 robot to an 0-3 lifetime robot, but at least by that point, we kind of knew ultimately that was all it was going to be. If Series 10 still had the single elimination aspect in melees, it could have once again exited as a relative unknown. Donald Thump is a huge one where... Again, it didn't work in its redemption round fight, but it at least had the opportunity. Whereas if it exited after that single first round melee where it just kind of died on its own with a promising vertical spinner, we'd be just carrying on the Taurons and the like of the previous series and just never known.
Definitely. What's the thing that you highlight? And we've made mention to a couple, but as far as redemption rounds, like the best redemption round fights that keep somebody in, I think you'd have to say Androne versus Tauron, or Big Nipper versus Crackers and Smash. Like the fact that we got 2 of those fights, which we all know and have discussed in detail in iconic fights and stuff like that. There's some all-time great fights, and in a Series 9 format we'd have lost both of those machines and never seen them again, and arguably Big Nipper would still not get any recognition after all these attempts. Everyone would know it was a 2-time champion, and only Nick would actually be out there defending it.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, like Big Nipper basically started Series 10 in the redemption round. It was a non-factor in its first one, but
yeah, completely.
I definitely, if the attitude for Series 8 was I left Series 8 sad that the first round losers didn't get to fight again, maybe it was just the Disconstructor fanboy in me, but I would have liked a second chance for them, but that had never happened in a Robot Wars main competition before, and I was happy enough with the 4 fights for most robots in the second round that it was a success. Then Series 9, we left it thinking, okay, this didn't really work. I'm really missing out on those who lost in the first round, and I would like to give them a second chance, even if it comes at the cost of more second round fights that we're used to. For Series 10, we got that in a format that was not only giving all robots at least 2 fights, but it was also a totally unique format that no one had ever tried before. The whole idea of winning a first round melee outright was new to Robot Wars. Having redemption round at a different stage to everyone else was new. And there's of course a certain rumble that we've not even touched on, and we'll get to as it goes along. But this was something that I felt, if you gave me a week to come up with a format for a Robot Wars series, I don't think I would have managed to come up with this. It was really quite a stroke of luck that we had such a winning format, it did come at a gigantic cost, that being only having 30 robots in the series total, which is less than Series 1.
29 and a half, if you count Iron Ore 6 as half a machine, because it never worked.
Shout outs to them for that one. But yeah, I mean, when I first found out that Series 10 was only going to have 30 robots, I was livid, because the very first Wars had 36, and I think the biggest failing of Series 9 beyond the format is the fact that it couldn't expand on the competitor list at all. We went from 40 robots to 40 robots. We're supposed to see this show gradually improve, and we were kind of taken aback. We were willing to accept a small field for Series 8 because it was the first series after a very long hiatus. We at least expected follow-up series were going to increase in scope, not stay the same, but that's ultimately BBC's decision to just stick to 6 episodes in a season. It sucked, but it was the hand we were dealt. Then for Series 10 to not only stay the same, but actually reduce scope, it felt like a disastrous idea in that sense. But also, with the way each fight had a third place playoff across 5 episodes to specifically set up a 10 robot rumble, which wouldn't have worked as like a 14 robot rumble or beyond, it was a bad thing that we went down to 30 robots. But they had a format that not only made every episode really good, but it also was specifically designed to accommodate 30 robots. And at least, I think there's very few robots within that 30 that didn't at least contribute in a meaningful way. Nor are there too many massively notable robots that we had to miss out on. You know, there were plenty surfacing around Series 9 that we highlighted as getting rejected as a bad thing. You know, TR2 from a results standpoint was at least controversial. Losing Gabriel and Big Nipper upset a lot of people. Tough as Nails was bad for us. But Series 10, there weren't at this point too many notable rejections, especially when thankfully they at least had a couple of international side events to sneak the numbers up a little bit more, and pretty much every reserve that they invited happened to get in. There's also, you know, both Tauron and Hobgoblin were reserves, and if they never got used, then they would have remained an unknown quantity forever. I think it's for the best that they did get in and clear up those unknowns, even if it was at the cost of actual brand new robots like Triforce and everyone else that pulled out in the process of that. Deadlock, you know, Deadlock, we've at least seen it in the live circuit by now. It sucks that we had to lose them all, but I think it worked out for the best that we just cleared up any remaining mysteries with those reserves.
Yeah, we could see that push to exits flipper did in fact work, and you know, a few other things that could be brought in and yeah, affected. And then Nuts 2, you know, everyone was talking about how great Nuts 2 was, and all we saw of it was it getting yeeted out of the arena by Matilda's flywheel. So that's another example of one. Nick, do you have anything you want to add on the Series 10 format? Maybe touching on the 10 robot rumble and the novelty of that? I mean,
I was gonna butt in, but I was just thinking to myself, I don't think people need my expert opinion to decide that yes, Series 10's format was amazing. Like, everybody loves it for the right reasons, and even the weakest parts of it, which is just, oh, you get to see a bad robot twice, that's not even a bad thing in its own right, because it's like, well, yeah, they'd probably have been rejected for Series 11 for stinking out the joints, so you know, and even the worst parts of it,
it's still more content for nerds like us who love doing stuff. So,
well, yeah, I mean, frame by frame analysis of when Donald Trump's weapon dies. I mean, it's perfect, isn't it? So, I'm not going to complain about that.
And it was also easier to digest as a format, I think, as well, for people who maybe aren't quite as hardcore as us. I remember going out to America to see the US dub of Series 8 Episode 1, watching it with someone who'd never seen Robot Wars before, even though they were invested in BattleBots. I remember when Nuts rolled out for the 4th time, they were all just vocally saying, "Why is it still here? It's done nothing but lose." We know why it was necessary to give Terahertz an opportunity to win, but just at a surface level, it did at times raise questions of why are these fights still happening, whereas for Series 10, everything had a purpose. The one with the least purpose would be the third place playoff, but the 10 Robot Rumble alone gave that enough hype and justification to exist. And it also happened that pretty much all of them that took place happened to be good fights. You know, what would the worst be? Like Iron Ore versus Androne, we still had a pitting. I can't think of a bad one. Well, I guess Heat 3's lack thereof, but...
Well, I mean,
I was going to say, did you watch episode 5?
Okay. But either way, as you say, every fight had some form of a purpose, had a little bit extra stakes put on it. You couldn't even coast through a melee as the second best robot anymore. You know, you had the intention to go out and win and not make life harder for yourself.
Yeah.
So,
I dread to think which 10 robots you'd cut from Series 9 if you brought the Series 10 format forward a year.
Let's do it. Let's do it right now. I can tell you without a doubt that we could easily cut 10 robots. And those who are listening, put them in the comment section below. Which 10 robots would you cut from Series 9 to have the Series 10 format? So going through them all, I think let's try and cut 2.
God, that's grim. I mean, it's easy to do with power of hindsight when we know the likes of...
try and do 2 from each episode.
Well, certainly we knew that the likes of Push to Exit and Hobgoblin failed in the end, but we couldn't have known that before. Would I pick Hobgoblin on pure potential in a field of 30? I might have to.
For the sake of discussion, let's just quickly do 2 per episode. So episode 1, you've got Aftershock. I would say that we're going to keep Aftershock, Terahertz, Sabretooth, and Rapid pretty confidently. So that leaves us with Nuts 2, Tomahawk, Cranky, and Jellyfish. I think you all know that my votes to cut are probably going to be Jellyfish, and I would probably say Tomahawk. There's a little bit of me that I really loved seeing it come back, especially with the Dutch robot girls in control of it, but Cranky was just too much of an unknown to want to get rid of it completely. Plus, you've got the Team Cold Fusion, callback still in place. Nuts 2 being, a famous fan favourite was probably never going to go. What are your thoughts?
I think Tomahawk's the only clear one you can get rid of here. Jellyfish is the weakest on paper, but even then, the producers may have thought, we can always play into the Jellyfish and Nuts storyline either way. So
it was certainly unique.
So it's one of those.
But episode 2, would you agree with me, Draven and Hobgoblin?
No, to be honest. I agree with Draven, but Hobgoblin was a first of its kind, really. Yes, it turned out to suck in that episode, but we couldn't have known that in advance. It's like saying you cut Robo Chicken from the Series 7 Annihilator because it did awfully, but you wouldn't have expected it to. I think Cobra is a robot that I enjoy.
Pretty clearly Cobra. It would have been pretty clearly Cobra for me. I remember when the Series 9 lineup was announced and everyone was like, well, this thing looks boring as fuck. So at least with Cherub, it's got a bit of a design. It's got interesting lifters, an interesting wedge. The team...
We know it was deliberately picked over Gabriel, but like Cobra, I enjoy it. I really like it, but I was also stunned it actually got picked in the first place.
Oh, yeah.
That's a really good point, and that's where I've got my hindsight bias, where I'm saying, we know Hobgoblin sucked, and we know Cobra is good, whereas beforehand, I had Hobgoblin picked to win the heat, hilariously.
So there you go, that's an objective failing, you could say, of having to use the Series 10 format. We lose Cobra, which is a bad thing.
Yeah. Episode 3, God, where would you even begin? Again, I wouldn't get rid of
I think we'd wipe out half of them just to keep robots in other heats, let's be honest.
I would say probably Expulsion and Chimera are probably the 2 easiest. Foxic did look better. And Heavy Metal we knew was capable of stuff when it worked. So I would say Chimera and Expulsion would probably be the 2 that you'd get rid of. I'm still amazed that Chimera made it in, but...
Personally, Chimera and Heavy Metal. Expulsion, you need the extra school angle in there. Yeah, you need the kids.
The show was ultimately revived on a concept of being educational. So
and Heavy Metal's kind of just like, it's a wedge with a lifter that's kind of slow and it's a bright colour.
Yeah. And again, I would have been devastated to hear that the 13 Black team applied for the reboot and never got in. That again would have been very bad for me with the power of hindsight.
But equally,
it's losable.
if we hadn't seen what heavy metal actually was, and you just heard like, oh, the first team black team were turned away because they had the wedge, it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah. And then Series 4, Episode 4, I think we're pretty comfortably we'd all cut Frostbite. Not only was it an additional spinner, it was by far the worst spinner, and High Five as well.
High Five definitely was losable. You know, Worm didn't add up to much in the end, but the idea of the Overdoser team coming back with something good
exactly.
is nice. Frostbite would be the personal pick because it wasn't a very interesting or good robot. But again, if they need to hit their school entries quota to keep the show alive, then if we're forced to pick someone else, well, actually, we know that Apex was a reserve for the series, so they would have not made the cut for this one. They only made the cut as a result of someone else dropping out. I can't remember who that was, but without us even needing to discuss it, Apex is actually the first one to go, even ahead of High Five, remarkably. And again, that would have been a really interesting picture of a robot to have in the pits as an unused reserve. Again, we know it didn't work very well, but I bet if Apex never fought, it'd have a bit of a Series 7 Sabretooth kind of reputation.
I was going to say that, exactly that.
Definitely. Yeah. And then Episode 5, I think we'd all lose Rusty because it was like one of the very last minute additions to the show.
If you if you have to cut down to 39, it's still Rusty that goes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Rusty and Trolley Rage.
Trolley Rage, yeah. I was going to say, they wouldn't lose Miss Nightshade.
Oh, you know what, though? That's annoying.
Roboteer.
It's unfortunate, though, because, again, we know for this heat, Trolley Rage was not a reserve. They were picked by the producers well in advance. And Mega Mouse was. They were the one that was the last minute addition. Again, you would want to keep Mega Mouse over Trolley Rage if it was your decision, but we know that if this was using a Series 10 format of 30 robots, Mega Mouse is like the second robot after Rusty to not make it. Which is unfortunate, but that's the way it goes.
Trolley Rage versus Iron Ore 6 coming in Series 10.
We've all unanimously got Miss Nightshade surviving as a result. But
oh, yeah, definitely. 100%.
So make sure you list your cut 10 for Series 9, and by all means do it for Series 8 as well if you'd like in the comments section. So just to recap, we were pretty unanimous on losing Tomahawk, Draven, Chimera, Frostbite, High Five, and Rusty. But yeah, by all means, put in your thoughts as well. So since we're talking about robots, let's go into the next topic I want to discuss, which is the robots themselves and the contestants. And we'll go back to Series 8, and we'll talk about what it was like refreshing the website until the robot photos were all uploaded. What do you think of the three series? What's the most exciting of the lineups for you? Sight unseen, so you just know that these are the 40 or 30 robots competing, and you don't know anything about them. Which of the three lineups got you most excited? I'll go first. Series 8. I was extremely excited when I saw Series 8's lineup because for me, I was such a nostalgic fan of the original run of Robot Wars, and I was very excited to see that they were doing the sort of the informal seeded machines where you had Bonk was the seeded machine for Heat 1. For example, you had a Series 7 semi-finalist in every single heat, and you had robots that you would never have imagined to still be around, let alone coming back. Like you had your Chompalots, you had your Thermidors, you had Draven of all machines to come back. Like
the General
was back. You had very obvious nods to the classic series, like you had Glitter Bomb being like the Dominator 2 type. You had Apollo being very much a Chaos 2 Panic Attack stand-in, and Gabriel being the new Stinger. It was very,
and I
very
guess
exciting.
When you'd look at the team photos, you'd be looking at Killy Cranky, you'd be thinking, interesting rabbit, and then you're like, is that fucking Robin Herrick in there? It's like, yeah, fucking hell.
And you've got all the essentials in there as well.
So much.
But at the end of the day, they had, it's a shame we didn't have the likes of Chaos 2 and Hypnoris to fully bring back the nostalgia of the old days, but you want to have at least the biggest name in the show's history. I would say Razor is fair enough for that. The fact that it happened to do poorly is an accident, but also you need to at least try to carry on the longevity of Series 7, and you've got Typhoon 2 semi-represented by its driver building his own horizontal spinner. That's near enough, but we also have Storm 2 itself coming back to essentially be the stand-in defending Robot Wars title. But then you got
Terahertz coming back to not go on a withdrawal.
Yeah, the fact that there happened to be one Series 7 heat winner in every heat was clearly not intended, especially Bonk being the one in place of Behemoth and Razor and Terahertz in episode 1, but it did work out that way, and there was a really good balance of live event heroes, Robot Wars mainstays, and the utterly unexpected returners like Terra Turtle and Disc Constructor and Supernova. We've not heard anything from in a decade. And sure, there were a lot of really eyebrow-raising rejections as well, like Ripper and Pulverizer, and what's some of the absolute worst ones about not Gravity was obviously a bit of a vocal controversy where someone from the top 8 of Series 7 actively didn't get in. And yeah, we know that version of Gravity never would have lived up to the hype of the original one. Certainly Series 8's lineup could have been even better with more than 40 slots, but without knowing the total list of who applied, I think we ended up with a really good lineup in the end. And some of obviously all the brand new robots, like Carbide, Mr. Speed Squared at the time, there always could have been more, and at least even some live circuit mainstays like Team Shock had a brand new robot in Shockwave. I think Series 8 wins this by a landslide, but also there's a clear loser in that Series 9 had the same amount of robots, and every new robot had to come at the cost of someone else's former place, and pretty much all of those spots, well, a significant portion of them were designated to brand new spinners, and you were losing not only the robots that you would have liked to see in Series 8 in the first place, but you're also losing robots from Series 8. And definitely that selection of robots was probably the least enticing, whereas Series 10 was somewhere in the middle. You had less robots, but a lot of them you were really glad to see back, and some of the actual newcomers looked very interesting indeed, while you weren't also forced to rely on the reputation of the classic series at that point. The Reboot stars had come into their own. So 8, then 10, then 9 for me.
Very good.
I'm going to be very boring with my answer and say that I look forward to all of them, basically in equal amounts. Series 8 does win by default, because it's the first new competitor list in however long. But honestly, like when I'd load up Series 9 for the first time, I'd see Aftershock looking amazing after something as basic as Shockwave. And then you see Rapid, which looks interesting. You see PP3D promising to be more developed than last time, more reliable.
Especially with Toast's name on it.
Exactly. 4's design looked interesting, developed from the kind of boxy look from Series 8. Supernova looked great. Pulsar looked beefier. Ironside looked like it could be at least a bit better.
Like it won't get robbed this time.
Yes, that too. And Carbide and Apollo, it was just nice to see everybody there, but also the new funky designs like Midnight Shade and Coyote looked cool. So I was just excited for all of them. So I have no complaints.
I would say that Series 9 was the one where I looked at it and I was excited to see the new versions of some of the machines. Like you said, Aftershock. And I was excited to see like the color popping on people like Hobgoblin and Concussion and Heavy Metal. But it was the one where I immediately said, right, some of these are going to suck. And you could tell instantly that High Five and Frostbite and Apex, I won't be convinced on Apex. I knew it was going to lose every single time, and it did, and I was right, and I'm sad that I was right. But it was the one that I was least excited for. Like Crackers and Smash, you had a cluster bot that seemed to have like one weapon between them, and I wasn't as excited. I was excited because there were new photos and there was a new series, and I was passionate enough. I was riled up from Series 8 to say, right, let's correct some injustices around, let's see Bearmoth win, let's see a few other, like Ironside win, and there was some good stuff in there, but that was definitely the least exciting. Series 10, I was bummed out by the reduced lineup, but I was still excited, and I was especially excited to see, would you believe it, Iron Ore 6, which we'll come back to, I suppose, later on. So yeah, and of course the fact that Toast, you were at the filming, you sort of saw it all beforehand. And I remember messaging you when Series 9 was coming out saying, will you please at least tell me if there's anybody new coming back? And you said, yeah, Cross Station. And of course I was extremely excited and it shouldn't have been. But still no regrets.
I gave you a nice little non-answer there, effectively.
Yeah. So what about you?
Yeah, and I guess it's worth bringing up, though, because it definitely did paint my perspective of the Series 9 newcomers in a different light, because basically I turned up to the filming of the second round for, I think, 3 of the 5 heats. So basically for 3 of the episodes, I knew who was going out in the first round of those, and also my first reaction of who was in this series was the robots who'd made it that far, whereas, robots like High Five I learned at the same time as everyone else, but I remember the dismal feeling of Thor's heat where I say, right, the next 2 fights, who's going to be in it? And I see that Thor, Mr. Speed Squared, and Foxic are in the same one again. I guess Foxic wasn't in the second round, I learned that one later, but specifically I saw Thor and Mr. Speed Squared roll out for a rematch, and I thought, oh god, has the reboot staled this badly already? I wouldn't have minded if Mr. Speed Squared didn't get in this series in the first place, knowing there's only 40 of them, let alone having these 2 fight again.
Yeah.
I went into Heat 4 and saw that all 4 of the robots at that stage were spinners, and I thought, okay, so we're getting a bit of a meta developing here, whereas Heat 3's lineup was very poor, and then I basically had like 16 robots to discover later as round 1 participants, but it is what it is. I never really got the authentic experience that you two can share on just going on the website and seeing who's going to be in Series 9. I just saw the crop of the winners, and that kind of painted a poorer picture than the original lineup might have been.
Yeah. All right. So that's sort of covered up on the contestants. We've all sort of been over it, I think. What was your favourite? Let's say your top 3 favourite new machines and your favourite new fights that came from the reboot. So I'll go first because I sort of have my answers that I know. Apollo and Aftershock, I've been very vocal, were my 2 favourites by far. Sort of falling into that new Chaos 2 Hypnodisc vibes for me. And I would say probably my 3rd favourite, well, I should know this. Someone will say heavy metal because they know that I love heavy metal. Just because for strange reasons. Let me just have a think about this. Shouldn't have put this one on myself with such limited time to answer it, but yeah, those 2 are definitely up. Are definitely probably the 2. I'll come back to you on my 3rd. Toast, you go first. What do you reckon?
You think I've prepared in advance? You know what? I think there's one that's worth me going over by itself, and that's my troubling relationship with Eruption. Because, you know what? For anyone who kind of hopped back onto the reboot, well, back into Robot Combat in general with the reboot, they might not have been familiar with the live circuit and gotten introduced to Eruption as a brand new machine for that, and one that you can judge in the same sense. And I think for Series 8 Heat 4 in particular, you could kind of break down who was a live circuit spectator and who wasn't by who thought Apollo was going to do better and who thought Eruption was going to do better. Because between those 2 machines, Apollo was a new robot for the reboot, but it was from an experienced driver who'd mainly competed with Chronic the Hedgehog and similar designs. To me, it was obvious that Eruption was going to be the better machine out of those two, or at least so I thought. And I thought if those two came together, it would be Eruption winning. Funnily enough, I went to the filming. I saw exactly Eruption versus Apollo was my very first fight of the reboot altogether, and Eruption won very easily. And then I was left thoroughly confused when I found out that Eruption was out and Apollo had won the heat. But if you could have kind of asked me, which good live circuit competitor would you want to see in a Robot Wars setting, I would have said Eruption, because it was just, I loved flippers more than any other weapon, and Eruption to me was the best of the crop. So I wanted to see that in a Robot Wars setting, but against things on its level. And sure enough, it had never fought spinners before, so there was still new discoveries to be made with Eruption in a Robot Wars setting. But I think it's very fun to see how it kind of evolved, because I think it's fair to say it wasn't a fan favourite in the end, and it's just a me thing that I happened to enjoy it so much based on the big flips and the clever driving and it being kind of underrated in Series 8. But by the result of maybe a poorer start and then very easily winning its fights in Series 9 and 10, it was overall not the fan favourite like Apollo and Chaos 2 ended up being. And I think it's just very typical that I'd been looking forward to Eruption this whole time, and when it entered Robot Wars, I basically got what I wanted from it, and the resulting reaction to that was so middling from everyone else. It just kind of summed up my whole journey with Robot Wars in one fell swoop, really. I was there as an Eruption fan from the beginning, and it won, and I'm like waiting to celebrate with people, and they're just not there. But I enjoyed it, and that's what counts, I guess, and I'm glad everyone else enjoyed Apollo more. But I guess if we're going to name if we're naming three each, I think seeing the advancement of Sabretooth was a really important one. It was never like a personal favourite, but it was a classic case of seeing an absolute nothing from the original run of Robot Wars turn into something professional and competent, and not only that, but also advance beyond Robot Wars and become an even bigger mainstay of the likes of King of Bots and BattleBots down the line. I think Robot Wars was really important to Sabretooth, just as Sabretooth was really important to Robot Wars, and that was something in the, when you're looking up competitors on the website for each new series, Sabretooth was always different, so it gave us something to look forward to with each series, and you can almost set apart Series 8, 9 and 10 based on which Sabretooth it had. Just kind of weird, because like the best Sabretooth was in the worst of the reboot series, you could say. I mean, some will say Series 9 was better than Series 8, but I think generally the consensus is 10, then 8, then 9. So Sabretooth had quite a fun opposite in that sense. But then if I pick a third, I really enjoyed Rapid. But I'll pick a brand new newcomer from Series 10 instead. Androne 4000, I think, was one of those where there was very little expectation of it, and then it just kind of surprised us all, did a lot better than it could have done, gave us a really good fight, and it was one of those where it entered with little expectation or hype and left as a robot that we all really liked. So I think that's a success for them in one series. They didn't necessarily need to come back for a Series 11 and show what they could do. They had quite a complete journey just by winning one fight and losing the rest in Series 10 alone.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, I'm going to say Heavy Metal for my third one. So, Nico, what do you?
Of course you are.
So, I mean, quite comfortably, I'd agree on Apollo and Aftershock especially. Seeing Aftershock just as the first episode of Series 9, just a really devastating vert coming in. It was beautiful after their rather timid Series 8 machine visually. But yeah, also Rapid. Most of that love from Rapid came from the little teaser they did for Series 9 Heat A, where they showed like the first 30 odd seconds from the very first fight of the series, just a few days before the episode aired. And you just randomly came along and thought, before the series, Rapid, it looks quite boring. Maybe it'll be an okay flipper. And then you just see the teaser trailer and it's flying jellyfish in the air and flipping everything around and just looking really fast and exciting. So that kind of gave me that immediate excitement with Rapid, and it and the team were always really good fun to watch, and I would have liked to have seen it even more. So yeah, also Coyote, but I'm not going to admit to that properly. So yeah, I'll end it there.
You know what? Rapid filled quite an interesting role as well, because as a wedge flipper from the UK, in theory, it was extremely replaceable. Sure, it was a lot more manufactured and machined than the typical live circuit flipper, but that, only meant so much to the engineers and kind of the speed of the robot. We still know that if it was a more conventional live circuit flipper, it probably would have worked similarly well. And there's always the thrown around cases like, Toxic 2 won a world championship on the live circuit, it should have been there. And yeah, in theory, if you swap out Rapid for Toxic 2, that would do kind of slightly less well, but still more or less give big flips, then it almost feels like you're not losing too much. But they were, at the end of the day, more than just a flipper. They were kind of someone that you were allowed to hate because they were very financially well off, and it was evident in the robot. And kind of seeing them go out in Series 9 felt like a comeuppance of some kind, and then they got to be replaced by the cheaper jellyfish. And then Series 10, it's like, okay, what can the robot actually do? And just by being a wedge flipper in a field where you could have easily picked any other, it did manage to stand out in its own, almost by being hateable, but then being endearing once it gave us bigger flips, the likes of things that you probably wouldn't have expected from the others. So again, it's not something that everyone loves. I think it's more our type that really bought into Rapid positively, and many will have finished Series 10 thinking it was horrible and that they just Robot Wars is no place for the rich and that stuff. But it was certainly a unique take from the type of robot you wouldn't expect to garner that kind of reaction, I think.
No, very good, very good. And what about favourite fights? So just for some basic content, your favourite fight from each, maybe one from each series. I think everybody knows my favourite from Series 9 is going to be Heavy Metal versus Mr. Speed Squared. Favourite from Series
This
8
is what he's come on the podcast to do. It was your idea to have this reflecting on the reboot.
Never change.
The only way we're going to, short of a Team
reflecting
13
on the Heavy
podcast.
Metal versus Mr. Speed Squared fight. Still excellent.
Tell you what, everyone have a little think about what your favourite fights might be, because I guess while we were talking about formats, we never actually talked about the 10 Robot Rumble itself as a success.
True.
So this is a kind of good way to feed back into it in, was it worth the hype? Was it a good fight? Would it be worthy of this kind of discussion? And it was a good fight. Like, it's got a lot more to offer than a traditional Robot Wars fight just by having 10 machines, more minutes of content, a lot was going on. In the end, it probably could have been a lot better, but it also wasn't disappointingly bad or anything.
No,
certainly the idea of having it was fantastic, and I definitely wouldn't trade it off, even if it was to get 10 more robots or whatever into Series 10. It was a magnificent little idea, and it paid off. It did have the most obvious winner at the end, we would say, and there were a lot of self-pittings and a lot of robots that just didn't work. Thor didn't have a weapon, the spinners didn't work, the Fog of War ruined it, the pit going off ended up permanently shrouding the vision of the fight, and there was a lot that just wasn't brought attention to, like Big Nippers being pitted by Eruption or Dead Metal sneaking in. It's like they lowered a wall to put an extra house robot in there, and then because it didn't do anything, they basically pretended it never happened and didn't draw attention to it. I'm just amazed at the end of the day that they managed to find time to fit it into the grand final episode without impacting that grand final in a bad way. There was nothing visibly missing from the grand final episode. I guess you just cut out on team introductions because we know who they all were, and it gave us at the end of the day a pretty much perfect episode. So a success, but you always wonder what a second 10 Robot Rumble could have been like if it was even better.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would ever have been a bad fight necessarily, because you're always going to have at least a handful of really good machines in there. There's too many machines in there for it to be a complete stink fest, but it's just nice to have that big notable event to look forward to before an even more important event of the grand final. So I think they were bold to go for it, but right to go for it. And even if it was going to be a disappointing fight, which it wasn't, but even if it was going to be, then it's one of those things. I was happy to have it there either way, and it just adds that extra bit of narrative, allows someone to sneak back into the grand finals. So I wouldn't have complained either way about it.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so that was a good reflection on that. Any other great fights you want to just chuck on and mention?
I think we'd be remiss not to talk about Carbide versus Gabriel, as probably I feel like if you're just trying to think off the top of your head what are the standout fights from the reboot, I guess the ones that come to mind are probably Carbide versus Gabriel and Carbide versus Eruption on the second occasion in the title fight. But even then, this is the benefit of doing this podcast in 2022. You know, if we did it even a year earlier, I think we'd have fights flying at the top of our heads, whereas it's finally been long enough where we actually have to think about it and be like, oh yeah, Big Nipper versus Kraken and Smash was really good. You know, nowadays we're spoiled by spinners in BattleBots all the time, but it was great back then.
And I'm still I think you're right. That I'm obviously the first person to say recency bias all the time, and I think now we can say confidently that Eruption versus Carbide was a really good grand final, and Androne versus Tauron wasn't just good because the robots were both not great, but they made a really, really good fight. I think it was a really good fight as it was, and we're not as afraid to say that because now we're 6 years out from Series 8 basically. It's been quite a while, and we're I think almost 4 years out from Series 10, given that there's one every year. So yeah,
4.5,
definitely a few big ones to call. Aftershock versus Big Nipper, of course, was always a great one.
Oh god, you've put it in my mind now. If you're going by filming dates, Series 10 happened in March of 2017, so filming-wise, It was 5 years ago. Oh my word.
And of course, the most satisfying part of the reboot has to be the Behemoth narrative. How could you make Behemoth hit rock bottom even more than it was in Series 7? Everyone thought that, losing to Mute in the way it did was probably rock bottom, and it got a nice little winning in the House Robot Rebellion to make up for it. But then to come back in Series 8 and get a little bit of a glimpse of promise, and then to lose in Series 9 so repeatedly and so unsatisfactorily, and then to get as high as it did, I think was also really, really probably almost single-handedly justified the reboot in itself.
Yeah, and then the surprise run of Nuts 2 in Series 10 was similarly good. You maybe can't reflect on any of the individual fights as an all-time classic, but it didn't need to be. In that case, it was the run in general that was, at the end of the day, we're not making another top 100 fights. Just what made Series 10 good? Nuts 2 was a significant portion of that.
Definitely.
Not so many stories like that in Series 8 to 9, but even with Series 8, it was still nice that every heat winner was a newcomer to TV Robot Wars, at least, even if a lot of them were experienced from outside of it. We did get a grand final of nothing but new to Robot Wars teams to truly pave the way for the future, and then 3 series later, we can truly build what we'd want as an ideal conclusion to all of this, and for the most part, we kind of got that.
Definitely. Well, let's talk about something a little bit sadder, which is why we think the show didn't last. Obviously, it didn't go for another 7 seasons for whatever, for example. We got 3. They were all 3 pretty short. Why do you think it didn't last? Well, why do we know it didn't last, for example? Because obviously I'm in Australia, so I don't follow all the scheduling stuff. I was watching it online every time, so...
Pretty much the reason it got put together in the first place. Like, the stars aligned for us to have this little vacuum of nostalgic content, but I don't know, it never seemed like there was a plan or structure in place for it to work. People have always pointed out the advertising and the reluctance to expand the show and TV scheduling, what it would be against, and ultimately, as much as we love it, it is a really niche show, and back in the day, it was one of those novelty things where it looked nerdy, but also you didn't know about it, so people would want to try it and see if it was for them, or if it was just a nerdy thing, so people would take that like guilty pleasure liking of it, whereas even though after the show went, it was still looked back with a fond memory, the show was still also looked at kind of jokingly by like the general British public, so it was one of those things where people would probably be happy to dip in for a bit of nostalgia, but then they'd think, this show's still ultimately a little bit cringy. I don't know if I'll invest in it full time. The hardcores still will do, but the hardcores aren't big enough on their own to keep it going, and we can blame whatever we like for it failing, but ultimately it is that mixture of, I just don't think it was ever in demand enough for it to have a long shelf life as we would have liked.
Yeah, the fact that it wasn't really requested by the BBC in the first place somewhat told a story of things to come. It needed to fit a somewhat electrical engineering educational role, and it happened to be Robot Wars, but from the very beginning, Series 8 was airing at the same time as the Olympic Games. Like, if they really wanted to make it work, then they could have at least not thrown it to the dogs, and then Series 10 they did the same but worse, putting every episode on at the same time slot as something that maybe it wasn't necessarily going to be a massive deal, but Planet Earth got people watching TV again. It was that big of a deal. Like, we were already well into the Netflix and YouTube eras of everyone's lives at this point. People didn't just watch TV by default to pass the time anymore, but Robot Wars Series 10 aired at a time when people were actually paying for TV licenses just to not miss out on this nature show, and it was just... Series 9 was pretty much the only one with an opportune time slot, and that was the worst one to have one because it was the worst of the 3 series. So anything that could have gone wrong with it really did. I remember Battle of the Stars was meant to be their Christmas special, and it was 100% unadvertised. Like, it aired, nobody knew, and as it turned out, that wasn't such a bad thing, because if they did see Battle of the Stars episode 1... they would have been met with a contender for the worst episode of all time. But you could have at least aired the second episode at a different point and then advertised that. I don't know. It didn't feel like it was meant to succeed. But I think it does beg one interesting question, at least, because after Series 8 did just well enough to justify having more Robot Wars, I think they basically decided upon having Series 9 and Series 10 at the same time. Like, Series 10 was confirmed long before Series 9 ended. Series 8 ended, and we had to think, oh, well, hope it comes back. And then a couple of weeks later, it was confirmed. Whereas for Series 10, the applications were live before Series 9 had finished airing. Like, that was a known quantity, and I think they were commissioned at the same time. And we've all had our remissions about, like, all 3 series were only 6 episodes long, while 9 and 10 just happened to have 2 episodes elsewhere in different formats as a mild form of expansion. But it's always been a question in my mind of what would have happened if we said, instead of having 2 6-part series, what if we just had one 12-part series with 80 robots? We don't get the chance to come up with Robot Redemption. We just have to run with the head-to-head format for 10 heats or whatever the format is. Would we have had a good series if Series 9 was the last series ever, but it was double the scope? would that have benefited us in the long run or made things worse? I really don't know, and I don't think anyone of us ever can. But
Well, depends what robots fill those spaces. It could have been exciting and unpredictable. It could have been an absolute fucking train wreck. So, yeah,
definitely one of those what ifs. But in terms of why it failed, it wasn't really given much of a hope to begin with. Poor time slots, poor advertising, a fairly muted social media presence. The difference is so evident with something like BattleBots in the modern day, where Discovery Channel just loves it. They have maximum advertising from both their own social media channels and Discovery itself. The show's given enough episodes to breathe and have the opportunity to expand. The teams themselves get to have an input on how to help move things forward, whereas Robot Wars, it was very much, you were lucky to be here in the first place. We'll give you a £500 stipend. Let's not get carried away. You're on Robot Wars here. Well done for even getting invited. It was just the BBC's brainchild to make their own decisions with. They said 6 episodes. They said 30 robots, and we basically took what we could get for as long as it could last. And I'm just ultimately relieved we got 3 series at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely. All right. Well, then I suppose as a final takeaway, let's just ask ourselves the question: is what would you do differently that we wouldn't, or what would you do in a future reboot that you might
Oh, Christ.
do to set it up for a little bit better success? Like, I know, Toast, you work in marketing. What would you do differently if they came to you, Robo Challenge came to you and said, we want to run a limited series of Robot Wars, let's call it another Series 10 format with 30 machines. How do we make a success so we get picked up for another one?
I think it's kind of interesting to understand where we'd be at in terms of the competitors to really decide how you're going to market it and format it and whatnot. Because
let's assume that it's tomorrow. They come to you and they said, we're going to 12 months from now, we're going to run another series.
We basically have a discussion here of, does this count as a third reboot at this point, or are we continuing on from where we left off in Series 10? I think a lot would be decided just based on what the arena looks like, who the presenters are. If they picked different presenters and made a different arena, then it would be hard to deny.
Let's call it another reboot. Let's call it another reboot, because Angela's got a couple of kids now and is probably off doing all of her things, and Dara's obviously got a lot of projects. Jonathan Pierce probably is a bit of an ask for him to come back another time, which is something we've got to touch on. How wonderful it was we got to have like Noel Sharkey and Jonathan Pierce for that. We talk about the robots, but how good it was we got that little bit of continuity there.
Yeah, and how angry people were that Craig Charles wasn't going to be back. And
I was going to say,
as it turned out, that he probably just wouldn't have suited the vibe of the reboot.
So let's call it another reboot then, shall we?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I imagine it would be somewhere in between in reality. Like, I think the arena still exists in some capacity, so chances are a lot of what was used for these ones is going to get used again, but it's hard to see it just as the 4th reboot series. But a lot has changed in the field of the actual competitors involved, and not necessarily in a good way. I think it's ultimately fair to say Robot Combat has only become more competitive than ever and more expensive than ever. I think that's one of the main things that makes Series 10 and backwards feel older than they are. The robot technology has come a long way, but in ways that aren't like overtly visible. Simply, robots are getting more powerful and quicker, and there is a big dependence on having spare frames, spare entire separate robots. We remember for Series 10, Sabretooth turned up with a separate working Sabretooth, and they were slated for it. They were instructed by Robo Challenge as producers to disassemble the second Sabretooth because it was unfair, and they were the only robot there to have a complete spare. Whereas nowadays, you're seen as silly for not turning up with at least one spare. Granted, the likes of BattleBots has a different format where you have at least 3 or 4 fights guaranteed, and there's going to be bigger spinners than ever to deal with. Certainly, if Series 9 happened and everyone had a spare competitor, then things could have been very different. But it raises the entry barrier a lot. BattleBots was always meant to be the cream of the crop, the absolute best robots come together to see who should be a world champion, whereas Robot Wars, even though it had less spaces and was ironically harder to get on, it was at least meant to feel approachable and that anyone could build a robot and compete on it. But the fact of the matter is, you have to keep some of your all-stars, like your Team Carbides. Monsoon would almost certainly be Tauron 3 for this new reboot, and the fact is a lot of them would turn up with 1 to 2 spare robots and be ready for every fight, and many would be outclassed. And I just wonder how they could portray that properly. Like, Series 10, Vulture was a complete newcomer at that point and didn't do especially well, but if that team would have come back, cough with me on it potentially. But I'm trying to put aside the fact that I'm part of the team and just say, if we came with Abrasion, which we've applied for every modern season of BattleBots with, I feel like as long as nothing goes too badly wrong, the jump from Vulture to Abrasion would be almost unbelievable, and there'd be other teams doing the same thing. I just wonder if that sense of Robot Wars approachability might be lost because unavoidably BattleBots has lived on for so long without Robot Wars that it's kind of taken over the UK scene and forced them to adapt to that way. So it comes with its issues right off the bat. But I just hope at the end of the day there would be enough brand new teams to fill genuine newcomer roles and create a balanced field and not have another Series 9 again where there's such an imbalance, but now even worse.
Yeah, and I think what the answer to that is, because we always look at the example that I always make is you compare Jellyfish to 101, and the charming nature of the whole low budget machine, where a low budget machine can go up against a high budget machine because the high budget machine is King Buxton, not Sabretooth or Rapid. So the high budget stuff is all the internal stuff that we don't really notice. And like you said, that is still the case now, but more and more is that impacting the sport. So I think that the answer to that is what they were going to do, which was to play up the lower weight classes. Because I think with the improvement of cameras and everything like that, and I think that you could very easily run a heavyweight all-star BattleBot caliber machine where the wealthy and established teams like the Sabretooths and the Carbides and the Aftershocks are in place and keeping up would be the A-list event. And then you get the educational, and you almost make it that the featherweight or the lightweight competitors have to be newcomers. So you get the famous faces in one. You almost run the two events simultaneously. I think that would be the answer, and I was really disappointed, as I'm sure we all were, when they announced they weren't going to do the featherweight tournament, which they originally were going to do for Series 10. But that's how I would do it.
Because it would be so easy to just accept the mini versions of the heavyweights that are already there. Have your featherweight Sabretooth, have your featherweight, Amnesia if we're going to have Immersion instead of Vulture, that kind of thing. All these robots, for the most part, already exist, and those were kind of some of the bigger novelties of Series 7, like seeing a little DTK and a little Ripper were usually the ones we liked the most. But I think by actually outlining it as a newcomers-only competition, that's a great little idea, and it wouldn't just make the show feel more approachable, it would make the show more approachable. It would actually succeed in doing so. And then, at the end of the day, the mentality of robots having entire 2 to 3 spare versions of themselves is not something we can prevent anymore. So that would be a good angle to take, especially if the field is like 30 or 40 with still a reduced small field. What do you think, Nick?
Oh, it's where the hell do you start? The thing with the reboot was, although I personally like the mix of educational and sporty action mix. I think what BattleBots does best is ultimately just make the action look as epic as possible. And I think you'd need to give Robot Wars a platform to make sure that you can make the show look epic, because a lot of the stigma with Robot Wars is it isn't cool as such. It's an ironic love. It's one of these things that people just watch and then not watch. You want it to be something like BattleBots, where they want to watch every week because it's genuinely exciting and cool, rather than just being like, yeah, we'll chuck a lot of educational stuff in here. We'll promote it for school kids and stuff like this mainly. We'll make it a kid-friendly audience. It was just a mixture of everything in the reboot, and it didn't really find an identity with a main crowd. I think being on the BBC itself was something that probably ran its course, which is a shame in itself, because Robot Wars would need a platform like that to be big. But I think if it was on the BBC, it would always have a kind of not fully having an identity angle to it. So I think you'd need to find that homely channel that would try and make Robot Wars as cool as possible, while keeping the root aspects of it. Try and get away from these labels that it's had in the past and move it forward, because I always just felt the reboot was kind of stuck in a limbo about trying to be one thing or the other, and it never really had an identity, and that kind of didn't help it in itself. It was trying to be nostalgic but also modern, but it didn't really do either, because it catered to both of them just a little bit. So it's really hard. Honestly, in general, I do just think that robot combat in the UK isn't really a thing that's going to be viable on the TV permanently or for a considerable run of time. I do think it's just generally more of an American style thing in the modern era. So
yeah,
it's really difficult.
So what you're
for me
saying
to
is
give a concrete answer.
we need to reboot Extreme Warriors, is basically what you're saying.
I mean, I'd love to say just show BattleBots, but make it a bit
Triple
as
Crown
as
does it
possible,
again.
but-
Yeah.
But yeah,
Panzer
really
Mark
difficult.
25 comes back and wins Extreme Warriors Season 3 in 2025.
But you know what? I will slip in one more thing with that, though, because it's what you say about finding a new audience. I think if the BBC were to bring Robot Wars back again, it just wouldn't do well, no matter how good the series is. Like, Series 10 was great, in our opinion, but it was never going to save the sinking ship. And BattleBots itself failed on ABC in one sense, or at least it got cancelled on whatever numbers we'll never know about. But it found a specialist channel, Discovery Channel, that would be willing to treat it as the star, but also have enough people watching it on TV to keep it afloat. With Robot Wars, the channel that people always throw around is stuff like Dave, because it does love quirky UK game shows and indeed airs Robot Wars reruns. But we all know for a flying fact, if a reboot of Robot Wars was made for Dave, it would not turn a profit for them. Like, Robot Wars is expensive as hell.
That's
to
the
run,
problem.
and
You need a mainstream channel to host it, but at the same time, if you have one of those things, it's probably going to have a specific... I'm not going to say PC, because that's a very interesting bit of terminology, but it feels like if it's on one of these main channels, it's going to be stylized in a specific way that might not suit it for success.
Which is why ultimately I think the only way it would stand a chance is what I think many people would see it as the perfect solution, but it depends on them being willing to take the risk. Basically, I think the only way it could possibly survive is if we ended up on Netflix or Amazon Prime or something of the sort, essentially move it off TV altogether.
Yeah.
They basically are the specialist thing that's willing to make a series their own and build an identity for it. The fact that Netflix took on Squid Game is, like, in hindsight, kind of crazy. That director was looking for 10 years for anyone to take him on with his frankly quite absurd concept, and then Netflix finally said, oh, go on then, I'll spend millions and millions making it for you. And then no one could have expected that was going to be their biggest success of the year, but it was. And And if Robot Wars was on an environment like that, I think we'd lose a lot in a sense. There's no week in, week out discussions of, I can't wait for the next heat. And the next one's going to be Nuts 2's heat, is the teaser clip that they've decided to use, apparently. Instead, the whole series would drop at once, and then you'd basically have to binge the whole thing in a night before you get spoiled on Discord. And we'd lose a lot of the community aspect of it at our level, but with the audience that matters the most of casuals, would a casual audience see Robot Wars turn up on Netflix and give it a try? Maybe. I wouldn't rule that out. In fact,
I think
people
so.
do at least have a bit of BattleBots on there.
I think that's basically the only hope we have, but it also depends on Netflix or Amazon Prime being willing to take that risk on Robot Wars rather than Robot Wars approaching Netflix or Amazon Prime for the opportunity. There's definitely a balance of power there.
My last thing I was going to add is, I think in the age of TikTok, what you'd have to do would be a degree of watch the competitors build the featherweights and then watch them compete. But you do it in that super sped up speed where they're flying through the all the content of, here's what I'm doing, and you've got the voiceover of here's what I'm doing, which is, I'm putting this motor in place here, I'm putting this weapon in place here, and I'm choosing this material because it's better. And then like you watch 5 minutes of that, and then you cut to them watching it. So instead of the interviews, you do this is me making the machine. You film it over whatever, however long it takes to build a featherweight, or even you're really just assembling it. You're staging the making of the featherweight, but that way you see the stuff in action as well. So, for example, that's cool. That's that hard ox metal. See how that held up to that spinner just then? That's pretty cool. Unfortunately, this machine couldn't use hard ox because they picked a bigger weapon, and the weapon and the weight was still too much. And I think also the weight limit would also benefit as well, because what made the reboot a little bit duller was that axes weren't good and stuff like that. Whereas if you drop the weight down and you take hard ox out of the equation, you might get someone who's got to choose between hard ox and a spinner, whereas they didn't have to do that in the heavier weight classes. So you might open up that open field, which is really what Robot Wars was so appealing about, was not knowing who was going to win. And that did, unfortunately, suffer a little bit more with the spinner boom in Series 9. So, if anyone's got anything else to add, we've just clocked an hour and 40 minutes, so we should probably wrap it up. Any last thoughts on
it's
remembering
a satisfying
the reboot?
conclusion, though, I think, because, you know what, even I can speak almost in the third person here. Approaching this podcast, I thought it'd be a nice reflection on what Robot Wars was, and ultimately explain why it could never really work again. But in this past 30 minutes, you know what? It's not completely impossible. I like the idea of just moving the heavyweights to be the best of the best and then focusing on the featherweights with the actual build process covered and make that feel approachable. If we put it on Netflix, then it's got a hope, at least. That depends on Amazon Prime being willing to take the chance, but it's nice to imagine. At least we can still keep the episodes relatively short or go a bit more. I think there is a solution there that makes a reasonable Robot Wars Series 11, like a soft Reboot 3 with the split between heavies and feathers, managing the balance, maybe regulating the rules a little bit more here and there. But it's possible, and I don't really blame the show for not making it that far. I'm just because I don't think there was ever the opportunity to grow, not with BBC funding. So glad we got what we got, but you never know. At least we do have another Robot Combat show that's airing with great success, and if Robot Wars were to come back, then we'd be there for it. Yeah,
definitely. All right. Well, thank you everybody for listening. As always, we are Toast, TG, and Nick. Love to hear you again. Love for you to hear us again soon, as we hopefully do a future project.